This is not my first speech, but as a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I want to speak on behalf of the people of Queensland and giving our condolences to Bob Hawke and his family of Bob Hawke, rather. I want to celebrate a life. I don't see this as loss or something that we park in our memory, because funerals are a wonderful time, memorial services, condolences are a wonderful time to celebrate a life well lived. And that is an important thing that we bring, to which we bring truth, because it is truth that really shines through. And Bob Hawke was one of Australia's best remembered prime ministers. I can even recall in 1983 being in Singleton's main street, John Street in Singleton, when I heard on the news that he had replaced Bill Hayden as the opposition leader. Now, there are very few things that I tend to remember like that. I know where I was when the moon landing occurred, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and yet I remember Bob Hawke becoming opposition leader. I actually didn't vote for Bob Hawke in 1983. I voted for Malcolm Fraser, much to my regret, but I did vote for Bob Hawke when the alternative was Andrew Peacock. And my dad has teased me forever for that, because my father was born as an underground coal miner family in Wales and understood the blight that the British Labour movement had put on the coal miners by nationalising their industry. So my father was no friend of the Labour Party, and he teased me about voting for Bob Hawke. But later on, my father would also call him the silver bodgie. And that was a term that some people used, but even as a term of derision, it was quite often with affection, which is quite remarkable. And we know that Bob Hawke is one of very, very few people in this country who is known by his first name. People would say Bob, and everyone knew who they were talking about. People say the same about Joe, and the same about Pauline. And I can't think of too many other politicians who everyone across the country knows from their first name only, Bob Hawke. My limited understanding of politics back in my 20s, in 1980s, was limited because I'd spent 3 years overseas in America. But as I understand it, John Howard lacked the support from Malcolm Fraser to implement many of the reforms that John Howard sought to implement. But that didn't stop Bob Hawke. He stole them and implemented them. And so did Paul Keating. And they made a wonderful pair, as I understand it. They picked up this whole country. It was like having a group of people and a sheepdog running into the middle and just shaking all the water and the mud off it and infecting everyone with its enthusiasm and then wanting to play and take off. And in doing that, Bob Hawke picked up this whole country. He did what his predecessors in the Labour Party failed to do, and what his contemporaries in the Liberal Party failed to do. He vastly improved this country. Now, he had some of his failures. The ACTU business ventures that failed, from memory there were Burke's in Melbourne and Solo petrol stations. His first attempt to run for Parliament failed, and then he went on later to win 4 federal elections on the trot. And of course, he said something that many people see as cynical. I know I certainly did at the time, and that was his pledge that there would be no child living in poverty by 1990. And he was clever and bold, and he got away with it. I mean, he was shorter than John Howard, but he referred to John Howard as Shorty. And that cheekiness, that boldness, left that tag with John Howard. So having discussed some of his past indiscretions, let's go on to the majority of where I want to talk, what I celebrate about Bob Hawke. Number one, his passion flowed. I can remember the tears rolling down Bob's cheeks when we heard about Tiananmen Square. And they were genuine. They were the sorrow, the sadness, the deep hurt, the senselessness of it all. That man was really in pain when he felt that. And then his daughter's battle with drug addiction. And the pain there, not only his pain as a father, but his pain for his daughter and her pain. And then we know in Queensland that Bob Hawke attended the Woodford Folk Festival every year for many, many years in a row. And he performed as Bob Hawke in the crowd and sometimes even on the stage. Another thing that I loved about Bob Hawke was that he was not politically correct. He was blunt and direct, and he thrived on it. He loved it. And in fact, today's Labor would not allow Bob Hawke to be Prime Minister. And yes, he wouldn't cop racism, which is wonderful, nor would he fling around the term racist idly. And that was significant because he was a man of character in that sense. He had a wonderful sense of humour and a brutal sense of humour. I can remember him dressing down some journalists. And he was especially down to earth. After all, One Nation now has another former Labor federal leader in our party today, who was also down to earth, has a wicked sense of humour. But I think what really matters with Bob Hawke, that gave him his connection with the Australian people, with politics, with the country as a whole, was that he was natural. He was who he was. He didn't pretend to be someone else. He was a larrikin, sure, as many people have talked about, in his behaviour, his approach, his sense of humour. And that's what led him to be so beloved by the people across Australia. Even his political enemies respected him enormously. And he had courage. He had the courage to do what the Liberals at the time lacked the courage to do. He had the courage to deregister the BLF in 1986. And recently he spoke out against the CFMEU. And another trait that I loved about Bob Hawke is his leadership abilities. Certainly he had a talented cabinet. I can remember some of them. Button. He had Richo to help him. But he shepherded them. And he did a wonderful job of doing that. He resurrected politics in this country, gave it some energy because he had energy, boundless energy. Not just quantity of energy, but he had a quality of energy. And that's what I like about him, because that shone through and carried him, and it also carried our nation. He initiated and instituted many, many reforms, not only in this country, but overseas. Madam Deputy President, when I was working in the underground coal mines in Kentucky, I came across a wonderful old-timer who'd had a stroke, and I had to help him out considerably because he couldn't go underground. And we tackled many challenges and brought in quite a few innovations in America. But my friend Guy actually said to me, Malcolm, there is only one thing we leave behind, and that is our name. And Bob Hawke's name is a worthy legacy of a life well lived. Thank you, Madam Deputy President.
Thank you, Senator